You think you know what medieval people were afraid of? War? Death? Disease? You're completely wrong. The thing that kept entire villages awake at night, that made grown men wet themselves with terror, was something so ordinary you probably touched it this morning without even thinking twice about it. I've spent years digging through medieval manuscripts, court records, and confession documents from the 1200s to 1400s, and what I found will blow your mind. These people weren't just scared of obvious threats like Vikings or the plague. They lived in constant terror of things that seem absolutely ridiculous to us today. We're talking about fears so intense that they shaped every single decision people made, from what they ate for breakfast to how they positioned their bodies when they slept at night. Here's what nobody tells you about medieval life. Everyone thinks these people were tough, battle-hardened survivors who could handle anything. But the truth is, they were absolutely paralyzed by fears that would make zero sense to us today. They weren't afraid of the things you'd expect. They were terrified of shadows, of cats walking across their path, of sleeping in the wrong position, of breathing the wrong kind of air. And here's the crazy part, these weren't just random superstitions. These fears were backed by the church, by scholars, by the smartest people of their time. Imagine living in a world where the most educated person in your village tells you that your neighbor might literally be the devil in disguise, or that a comet appearing in the sky means God is about to end the world. Today I'm going to take you through the 10 most terrifying fears that haunted medieval people every single day. Some of these will make you laugh. Others will make you realize that maybe we're not so different after all. But by the end of this video, you'll understand why medieval people lived their entire lives looking over their shoulders, checking shadows, and praying constantly just to make it through another day. Number 1. The devil hiding in everyday life. Let me start with something that sounds completely insane to modern ears, but was absolutely real to medieval people. They believed the devil could shapeshift into literally anything around them. We're not talking about some abstract evil force. They believed Satan himself could transform into a black cat sitting on their windowsill, into the wind that rattled their shutters at night, or even into their own neighbor walking down the street. Picture this, you're a medieval peasant walking home after a long day, working in the fields. The sun is setting, shadows are getting longer, and you see a black cat dart across your path. Today you might think, oh, a cat. But in medieval times, your heart would start racing because you'd have to wonder, is this just a regular cat, or is this literally Satan trying to tempt me into sin? This wasn't just a story priests told to scare people during Sunday Mass. This was documented fact in their minds. Court records from the 1300s show actual legal cases where people accused their neighbors of being demons in disguise. Village councils would hold emergency meetings because someone's cow died and they suspected their neighbor had transformed into a devil to curse their livestock. Think about how this affected daily life. Every shadow could be hiding a demon. Every animal behaving strangely could be Satan in disguise. Every stranger you met could potentially be a supernatural entity sent to steal your soul. Medieval people lived like they were constantly being hunted by an invisible predator that could take any form. The church made this worse by teaching that the devil was actively hunting for souls every minute of every day. Priests would give sermons describing in graphic detail how Satan would watch families through their windows, looking for moments of weakness. They said he could read your thoughts, that he knew exactly when you were vulnerable, and that he would appear in whatever form would tempt you most effectively. Here's a story that shows just how real this was to them. In 1428, a French village called Domremy held a 3-day trial because residents were convinced that a local woman named Margot was actually a demon who had taken human form. Their evidence. Her bread always came out perfectly baked, her chickens laid more eggs than anyone else's, and she never seemed to get sick during plague outbreaks. Obviously, she had supernatural help. The trial ended when Margot agreed to be tested by holy water. If she was really a demon, the water would burn her skin. When it didn't, they decided she was human after all. But think about living in Margot's shoes. Being too successful at normal life activities made people suspect you were literally Satan. You couldn't be too good at baking bread without risking accusations of supernatural evil. Women were especially terrified because church teachings said the devil preferred to appear as handsome men to seduce them into sin. Imagine being a medieval woman and having a strange man approach you on the street. You couldn't just think this might be dangerous. You had to wonder, is this an actual demon trying to steal my eternal soul? Men had different fears. They were told the devil often appeared as beautiful women to lead them astray. This meant that any attraction they felt toward a woman they didn't know could potentially be a supernatural trap designed to damn them to hell forever. The psychological torture was incredible. Medieval people developed elaborate rituals to protect themselves from these shape-shifting devils. They would sprinkle holy water around their houses every single morning. They carried special blessed salt in their pockets. Some people refused to go outside after sunset because they believed darkness gave demons more power to disguise themselves. Children were taught from birth to suspect everyone and everything around them. Medieval parenting manuals instructed parents to teach their kids that strangers might be demons, that animals behaving strangely could be devils, and that even their own thoughts might be influenced by supernatural evil forces. Living like this was like being trapped in a horror movie that never ended. Imagine if you had to question the reality of every person and object around you, constantly wondering if what you were seeing was real or if it was a supernatural predator in disguise. Medieval people lived every single day knowing that the person sitting next to them in church, the merchant selling them bread, or even their own spouse could potentially be a supernatural entity sent to destroy their soul. This wasn't just fear. This was a complete breakdown of trust in reality itself. But here's what's going to shock you even more. The medieval fear of devils in disguise wasn't actually about devils at all. Wait until you see what they were really terrified of when it came to their neighbors' supernatural powers. Number 2. Witches and curses. Now let's talk about something that makes the devil shape-shifting thing look almost reasonable, the medieval belief in witches and curses. But here's what's crazy. Medieval people weren't primarily afraid of witches flying around on broomsticks or brewing potions in cauldrons. They were terrified that their next-door neighbor could destroy their entire life just by looking at them wrong. The medieval concept of the evil eye was absolutely terrifying to these people. They believed that certain individuals, usually women, could curse you, your family, your animals, and your crops just by staring at you with malicious intent. One wrong look from the wrong person could literally ruin everything you'd worked for your entire life. Let me tell you about Agnes Sampson, a Scottish woman who lived in 1590. Agnes was a respected healer in her village until her neighbor's cow died 3 days after Agnes had complimented how healthy it looked. That single compliment was enough to get Agnes accused of cursing the animal through the evil eye. But here's the twist that shows how insane this system was. Agnes was also accused of witchcraft because she was too good at healing people. So she was simultaneously accused of having magical powers that could kill animals and magical powers that could save humans. The logic was that only someone with supernatural abilities could be that effective at healing, which meant she must be getting help from demons. Think about the impossible position this put people in. If you were successful at anything, farming, healing, crafts, even just maintaining your health during plague outbreaks, people might suspect you had supernatural help. But if you failed at things, that could also be evidence that you were a witch who was deliberately sabotaging your own activities to avoid suspicion. This fear was so intense that people developed elaborate social codes to avoid accidentally triggering a curse. You couldn't compliment someone's baby too enthusiastically, because that might seem like you were casting a spell on the child. You couldn't stare too long at someone's livestock because they might think you were cursing their animals. You had to be careful about how you looked at people's crops, their houses, even their food. Medieval court records are filled with cases where people blamed their neighbors for supernatural attacks. A typical case might go like this. Margaret's cow stopped producing milk the day after she had an argument with her neighbor Sarah. Obviously, Sarah had cursed the cow out of spite. Sarah would then have to prove she wasn't a witch, which was basically impossible. The church taught that God allowed witches to have real supernatural powers as a test of faith. This meant that curses actually worked. They weren't just imaginary. If your milk went sour, if your baby got sick, if your crops failed, there was a very real possibility that someone in your community had used supernatural forces against you. Here's where it gets really twisted. Medieval people believed in sympathetic magic, the idea that you could curse someone by doing things to objects that represented them. If a witch got hold of your hair, your nail clippings, or even a piece of clothing you'd worn, she could use those items to cast spells that would affect you from a distance. This paranoia reached absolutely insane levels. People would burn all their hair clippings rather than throwing them away. They would bury their fingernail clippings in secret locations. Some people would even burn their old clothes rather than donating them or throwing them out, because they were terrified that those personal items might end up in the wrong hands and be used for magical attacks. Women were especially vulnerable to witch accusations because medieval society believed women were more susceptible to demonic influence. Any woman who was too independent, too knowledgeable about herbs and healing, too successful, or just too weird could find herself accused of witchcraft. The tests for identifying witches were absolutely brutal and completely rigged. They would tie a suspected witch's hands and feet and throw her into a river. If she floated, that proved she was a witch because water would reject evil. If she sank and drowned, well, at least they knew she was innocent. Either way, the woman died. Think about this like being trapped in a community where everyone is carrying loaded guns, but instead of bullets, they're armed with accusations that can destroy your life instantly. You had to navigate every social interaction knowing that one wrong word, one suspicious glance, one stroke of bad luck that happened to coincide with a minor conflict could result in you being labeled as a supernatural threat. Children grew up learning to fear the women in their own communities. They were taught that the old woman who lived alone at the edge of town was probably a witch. The woman who knew too much about healing herbs was suspicious. Any woman who owned a cat was potentially dangerous because cats were believed to be witch familiars. Medieval people literally lived in constant fear that their neighbors had supernatural powers to destroy them. Every failed pregnancy, every sick animal, every bad harvest was potentially the result of a malicious curse cast by someone who lived just down the road. This turned medieval communities into paranoid, suspicious places where trust was almost impossible and accusations could destroy lives overnight. But the fear of curses from neighbors was nothing compared to what medieval people thought was happening in the sky above them. When they looked up and saw certain things, they didn't just fear for their crops or their livestock. They feared for the continued existence of the entire world. Number 3. Comets and eclipses equals doom. If you think medieval people were irrational about devils and witches, wait until you hear about their terror of astronomical events. These people saw comets and eclipses as direct messages from God announcing the end of the world. Not metaphorically, they literally believed these were God's way of giving humanity final warnings before destroying everything. Imagine if every time you saw an unusual cloud formation, you genuinely believed it meant nuclear war was about to start in the next few hours. That's essentially how medieval people reacted to comets and eclipses. When these events appeared in the sky, entire populations would fall into complete panic. People would abandon their homes, their jobs, their normal lives, and spend days or weeks praying constantly, convinced that Judgment Day had arrived. Let me tell you about what happened during the appearance of Halley's Comet in 1066. This comet is actually visible from Earth every 75 to 76 years, and we know now that it's completely harmless. But to medieval people, it was a smoking gun pointed at the world by an angry god. The comet appeared in April 1066, and by May, all of Europe was in absolute chaos. People saw it as God's warning about the Norman invasion of England, but they interpreted it as meaning the apocalypse was starting. Chronicles from that time describe people fainting in the streets just from looking at the comet. Churches were packed with sobbing crowds who were convinced they were witnessing the final days of human history. Here's the part that shows how deeply this affected their thinking. Families began giving away all their possessions because they thought money would be useless after the world ended. Farmers stopped planting crops for the next season. Merchants abandoned their trade routes. Some people literally stopped eating regular meals because they figured there was no point in maintaining their health if the world was about to end anyway. But here's what's really incredible. Medieval scholars made this terror worse by calculating exact dates when they thought the world would end based on astronomical events. They would study biblical prophecies, combine them with astronomical observations, and announce specific dates for the apocalypse. These predictions would spread throughout Europe faster than news of wars or plagues, causing mass panic and social disruption. Solar eclipses were even worse than comets. Medieval people had some understanding that eclipses were natural phenomena, but they still interpreted them as supernatural events. The sun was God's creation, and when it disappeared during the day, that could only mean God was angry enough to withdraw his light from the world. During the solar eclipse of 1239, which was visible across much of Europe, entire cities essentially shut down. People gathered in churches and prayed desperately for forgiveness, believing that if enough people repented sincerely enough, God might decide to spare humanity and bring the sun back. Children were taught that eclipses happened when God was so disgusted with human behavior that he temporarily abandoned the earth. I found a particularly heartbreaking account from a monastery in France during that 1239 eclipse. A monk named Brother Thomas wrote in his journal about watching grown men weep openly as the sun disappeared, convinced they were witnessing God's final judgment on humanity. He described how children clung to their parents, how elderly people fell to their knees in the streets, how the entire community seemed to believe they were living through the last day that would ever exist. The year 1000 CE was particularly terrifying because it marked 1,000 years since Christ's birth, and many scholars predicted the world would end exactly then. As the year approached, people stopped planting crops, stopped maintaining their homes, stopped planning for the future. Why build anything if God was about to destroy everything anyway? Think of it like this. Imagine if scientists today announced that every meteor shower meant the sun was about to explode. Every time you saw shooting stars, you'd have to wonder if you were witnessing the last night sky you'd ever see. That's how medieval people felt about any unusual astronomical event. Churches played into these fears because terrified people were more likely to confess their sins, donate money, and follow church teachings. Priests would give sermons explaining exactly how God used astronomical events to communicate his displeasure with humanity. They would describe in vivid detail what would happen when the final judgment came. The sun would fall from the sky, the stars would crash to earth, and angels would blow trumpets while the dead rose from their graves. The psychological impact was devastating. People lived their entire lives under the shadow of potential cosmic doom. Every time they looked up at the night sky, they were reminded that God might decide at any moment to end everything. Parents struggled with how to raise children when they genuinely believed the world might end at any moment. Medieval people couldn't just enjoy the beauty of a starry night or the wonder of seeing a comet. Every unusual thing they saw in the sky was a potential death sentence for all of humanity. They lived under a cosmos that seemed actively hostile, where God was constantly threatening to destroy everything they loved. But even the fear of cosmic destruction wasn't the worst thing medieval people had to worry about. There was something that terrified them far more than the end of the world itself. Number 4. The Church's judgment. Here's where medieval fears get really twisted. You might think death was what scared people most back then, but you'd be completely wrong. Medieval people were absolutely terrified of something much worse than dying. They were scared to death of committing tiny, seemingly harmless sins that would damn their souls to eternal torture in hell. The medieval church taught that your eternal fate depended on the exact state of your soul at the moment you died. If you died with even one unconfessed sin on your conscience, even something incredibly minor, you would burn in hell forever. Not for a long time, forever. This wasn't a metaphor or a threat. This was presented as literal, absolute fact. Let me tell you about a woman named Catherine of Genoa who lived in the 1400s. Catherine became so terrified of accidentally committing sins that she developed what we would today recognize as severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. She would confess to priests multiple times per day, sometimes spending hours examining every thought and action for potential spiritual contamination. But here's the twisted part. The more she tried to purify her soul, the more convinced she became that she was accumulating new sins. Catherine's journals, which still exist today, show the psychological torture these beliefs created. She wrote about feeling terrified that enjoying the taste of food was the sin of gluttony. She worried that feeling proud after helping someone was the sin of pride. She was convinced that having any sexual thoughts about her own husband was potentially damning because the church taught that even married couples were only supposed to have sex for procreation, never for pleasure. Think about how this affected daily life. Every thought, every word, every action was potentially eternal damnation material. Did you feel a moment of anger toward your neighbor? That was wrath, one of the deadly sins. Did you enjoy your dinner a little too much? That was gluttony. Did you feel proud of something you accomplished? That was pride, the worst sin of all. Medieval people developed incredibly complex moral accounting systems in their heads, constantly trying to track their spiritual balance sheet. They would confess to priests dozens of times per year, desperately trying to clear their souls of accumulated sin. But the system was rigged against them because the church taught that even the process of examining your conscience could lead to new sins. For example, if you spent too much time thinking about your past sins while preparing for confession, that self-focus could become the sin of pride. If you felt relief after confessing, you might be guilty of presumption, assuming God had forgiven you. If you didn't feel enough remorse, that was hardness of heart. If you felt too much remorse, that showed lack of faith in God's mercy. The church had incredibly detailed lists of sins that covered literally everything a person might do, think, or feel. Medieval confession manuals contain thousands of possible sins, organized by category, with specific penances assigned to each one. Priests were trained to ask probing questions that would uncover sins people didn't even realize they had committed. Here's a confession manual question that shows how impossible the system was. Have you ever felt pleasure during prayer? If you answered yes, that was the sin of spiritual pride, taking too much satisfaction in your relationship with God. If you answered no, that was the sin of spiritual coldness, not loving God enough. Either answer was evidence of spiritual failure. Sexual sins were especially terrifying because the church taught that any sexual thought or feeling outside of marriage for the specific purpose of procreation was mortally sinful. This meant that normal human sexual development was seen as a constant source of damnation. Teenagers going through puberty lived in terror that natural biological processes were sending them straight to hell. Even married couples were trapped in this system. The church taught that sex was only permissible on certain days of the week, during certain times of the year, in specific positions, and only if both partners were focused entirely on creating children. Any deviation from these rules, any moment of physical pleasure for its own sake, was potentially a damning sin. The psychological torture was incredible. People would lie awake at night replaying conversations from that day, wondering if they had lied, gossiped, or spoken uncharitably. They would examine their motivations for every action, wondering if they had acted out of pride, greed, or envy rather than pure love of God. Medieval people were especially terrified of sudden death because it might prevent them from confessing their latest sins. They lived in constant fear of accidents, violence, or disease that might kill them before they could get to a priest. The church taught that dying with unconfessed mortal sins on your soul meant automatic, eternal damnation with no possibility of appeal or mercy. This is like living your entire life knowing that every word you speak is being recorded by a perfect judge who will use even your smallest mistakes to decide whether you deserve infinite punishment. Imagine if every time you felt annoyed at traffic, every time you enjoyed a meal too much, every time you felt proud of your work, you had to worry that those normal human experiences might condemn you to torture that would last longer than the existence of the universe itself. But while medieval people were obsessing over the state of their souls, they were also terrified of the physical world around them, especially the unknown territories that might contain creatures beyond their wildest nightmares. Number 5. Monsters beyond the map. Medieval people had a completely different relationship with the unknown world than we do today. While we think of unexplored places as exciting adventures waiting to happen, they saw them as realms of absolute horror populated by creatures so monstrous they could barely be described. Medieval maps were covered with warnings about the creatures that lived beyond the known world. Mapmakers would draw detailed illustrations of dog-headed men called cynocephaly, who were said to communicate only through barking and ate human flesh. They showed Blemmies men with no heads whose faces were located in their chests. They depicted cypods people with one enormous foot that they used as a parasol to shade themselves from sun. But these weren't just decorative illustrations or symbols for unknown territory. Medieval scholars, travel writers, and church authorities presented these creatures as absolutely real. They cited ancient authorities like Pliny the Elder and built entire theological arguments around how these monsters fit into God's creation. Let me tell you about the most terrifying medieval monster story I've ever encountered. In 1177, a crusader knight named Reginald of Chatillon wrote a letter to his family describing what he claimed to witness in the desert near Jerusalem. He said his company encountered a creature that looked like a man from the waist up but had the body of a lion below. The creature could speak Latin, which terrified Reginald more than its appearance because it meant the thing was intelligent and educated. According to Reginald's account, the creature claimed to be a Christian who had been transformed as punishment for some unnamed sin. It begged the knights to kill it so its soul could be released from its monstrous body. But here's the part that kept medieval people awake at night. Reginald wrote that the creature knew personal details about each knight's life that no stranger could have known. It knew their names, their family histories, their secret sins. Reginald's men were convinced this was either a demon disguised as a monster or a human who had been transformed by supernatural forces as divine punishment. Either possibility was absolutely terrifying because it suggested that the line between human and monster was much thinner than people wanted to believe. The ocean was especially terrifying because medieval people believed it was full of massive sea serpents, krakens, and leviathans that could destroy entire ships just by surfacing near them. Sailors would tell stories of seeing islands that turned out to be sleeping sea monsters, or tentacles as thick as tree trunks reaching up from the depths to drag ships underwater. These fears had real economic and social consequences. Trade routes were planned to avoid areas where certain monsters were believed to live. Explorers would turn back from promising expeditions because they encountered signs they interpreted as evidence of supernatural creatures nearby. The medieval concept of wild men humans who had supposedly reverted to bestial state was particularly terrifying because it suggested that civilization was just a thin veneer over our true savage nature. Stories described wild men living in forests, covered in hair, eating raw meat, and lacking human speech. People believed that if you spent too much time away from Christian civilization, you might literally transform into one of these creatures yourself. Medieval Christianity taught that monsters were either demons in disguise or punishment sent by God to test human faith. This meant that encountering monsters wasn't just physically dangerous, it was spiritually significant. Seeing a monster might mean that God was angry with you personally, or that demons were trying to tempt you away from righteousness. Think of it like this. Imagine if you believed that traveling to any unfamiliar place meant you might encounter creatures that can not only kill your body, but also corrupt your soul just by looking at you. Every journey beyond your hometown became a potential encounter with supernatural evil that could destroy you physically and spiritually. The fear of monstrous races was intimately connected with medieval racism and xenophobia. People from different cultures were often described as having monstrous characteristics, unusual physical features, strange customs, or supernatural powers. The further away a culture was from medieval European Christianity, the more likely they were to be described as literally inhuman. Travel narratives from the medieval period are filled with stories of narrow escapes from monstrous creatures. Marco Polo's accounts include descriptions of dog-headed men, giants, and creatures that were half human and half animal. These stories weren't seen as entertaining fiction. They were treated as factual reports that proved the world beyond Christendom was full of supernatural dangers. Medieval children grew up with these monster stories as part of their basic education about the world. They learned geography not through maps showing countries and cities, but through descriptions of the terrible creatures that lived in each distant land. This shaped how they understood difference and otherness for their entire lives. The monsters weren't just physically threatening, they represented spiritual and moral dangers. Medieval scholars taught that seeing certain monsters could corrupt your soul, that some creatures could steal your ability to speak or think clearly, and that others could influence you to abandon Christian faith and revert to paganism or devil worship. Medieval people couldn't look at a map and see exciting places to explore. They saw a world where the familiar, safe realm of Christendom was surrounded by an infinite wilderness populated by creatures designed to destroy both their bodies and their souls. But while they feared the monsters that might exist in distant lands, medieval people were equally terrified of an invisible threat that they believed surrounded them every day in their own communities. Number 6. The plague and bad air. You might think medieval people were afraid of the plague because it killed millions of people, but their actual fears around disease were much weirder and more terrifying than just being afraid of dying. They lived in absolute terror of the air itself, convinced that breathing the wrong kind of air could kill them instantly. Medieval medical theory was based on the idea that disease spread through miasma, poisonous air that carried sickness. But they didn't understand this in the way we understand airborne viruses. They believed that certain smells, certain weather conditions, and certain locations could produce air that was literally toxic to human life. Let me tell you about the most paranoid thing I discovered in medieval medical records. In 1348, during the Black Death pandemic, a wealthy merchant named Giovanni Boccaccio wrote detailed instructions for his household on how to survive what he called the poisoned air epidemic. His rules included holding your breath while walking past any location where someone had died, even if that death had occurred months earlier. He believed that places where people died continued to emit deadly vapors for years afterward. Boccaccio's household was required to carry bouquets of strong-smelling flowers everywhere they went, holding them up to their noses constantly to filter out the poisonous air. But here's the really crazy part. He also believed that certain emotions could make the deadly air more potent. He instructed his family to avoid feeling afraid, sad, or angry because he thought negative emotions made people more susceptible to breathing in death. The smell of decay was especially terrifying because medieval people believed that breathing the scent of rotting organic matter could instantly poison your blood and kill you within hours. This wasn't just a concern about dead bodies. They were afraid of overripe fruit, stagnant water, swamps, and even compost heaps. During plague outbreaks, people would walk around carrying bouquets of strong-smelling flowers or herbs, holding them up to their noses constantly to filter out the poisonous air. They believed that pleasant smells could neutralize deadly miasma. Wealthy people would burn expensive incense in their homes continuously, thinking this would purify the air and protect their families from disease. But the really terrifying part was that medieval people believed bad air could be created by moral corruption. They thought that areas where sinful activities took place would literally generate poisonous vapors that could kill innocent people. This meant that disease wasn't just a medical problem, it was a spiritual attack caused by other people's evil behavior. Entire neighborhoods could be abandoned if people decided the air there had become corrupted. Sometimes this happened because of disease outbreaks, but sometimes it was just because people believed too much sin had taken place in an area and the very atmosphere had become toxic to human life. Medieval people were especially terrified of breathing night air because they believed darkness made miasma more powerful and concentrated. People would seal their windows tightly after sunset and wouldn't open them again until sunrise. They thought that air that had been sitting in darkness for hours was essentially poisoned, and that breathing it could cause immediate illness or death. This created a paradox that shows how torturous medieval life could be. People needed fresh air to stay healthy, but they were convinced that most air was potentially deadly. They would spend hours each day trying to determine which air was safe to breathe and which air might kill them. Swamps and marshes were seen as incredibly dangerous not just because they might harbor disease-carrying animals, but because the very air above them was believed to be thick with deadly vapors. People would hold their breath while passing swampy areas, or would take long detours to avoid breathing marsh air entirely. The church taught that God sometimes used bad air as a weapon to punish communities for their sins. When disease outbreaks occurred, people wouldn't just pray for healing. They would desperately try to identify what sins had caused God to poison their air supply. This led to scapegoating and violence as communities tried to eliminate whatever they thought was causing their spiritual and atmospheric problems. Think about this like living in a world where the air around you is like a minefield, but the mines are invisible and could explode at any moment. You need to breathe to survive, but every breath might be the one that kills you. Medieval people couldn't just walk outside and breathe normally. They had to constantly evaluate whether the air around them was safe or deadly. The psychological impact was devastating because air is something you can't avoid. Unlike other medieval fears that involve specific people, places, or activities that you could potentially stay away from, the fear of bad air meant that the act of breathing itself was potentially deadly. People lived in constant anxiety about whether their next breath might poison them. Medieval medical practitioners developed elaborate theories about which types of air were dangerous at different times of day, during different seasons, and in different weather conditions. They created complex charts showing when it was safe to breathe deeply and when people should try to minimize their air intake to avoid poisoning. Medieval people couldn't just worry about plague spreading from person to person. They had to live in constant fear that the very air around them was becoming corrupted and that breathing normally might kill them at any moment. But while they were obsessing over the air they breathed during the day, medieval people faced an even more terrifying threat that haunted them every single night. But wait, there's more. We've only scratched the surface of medieval terror. Coming up, we're diving into fears that were so intense, they literally changed how people lived, slept, and died. The next 6 fears we're about to explore will show you just how different life was when death could come from anywhere, at any time. Number 7. Ghosts and the restless dead. Picture this, you're living in a medieval village, and your neighbor dies. You think that's the end of it, right? Wrong. Death in medieval times wasn't seen as a final goodbye. It was more like, a pause. And sometimes that pause didn't last very long. Medieval people were absolutely terrified of ghosts and restless spirits. But these weren't the friendly cartoon ghosts we see in movies today. These were angry, vengeful beings who had unfinished business with the living. And they were everywhere. The fear was so real that entire communities would take extreme measures to keep the dead. Dead? When someone died, especially if they died in unusual circumstances, the whole village would go into panic mode. They believed that certain types of people were more likely to come back as ghosts. Murderers, thieves, people who died violently, anyone who had committed serious sins, people who died suddenly without last rites, those who were excommunicated from the church, individuals who had made enemies in life, people who died with unresolved debts or promises, those who were buried improperly, anyone who died during times of plague or famine, and even people who were just generally unpleasant in life. The list was basically endless. If you weren't a perfect saint when you died, there was a good chance people thought you might come back to haunt them. But here's where it gets really wild. Medieval people didn't just sit around waiting to be haunted. They took action. And I mean serious action. When they suspected someone might return as a ghost, they would literally dig up the body and do things to it that would make modern people sick. They would drive stakes through the corpse's heart, cut off the head and place it between the legs, weigh down the body with heavy stones, tie the corpse's hands and feet with rope, place iron objects on the chest, fill the mouth with stones or garlic, turn the body face down in the grave, and sometimes even burn the entire corpse just to be sure. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries shows that this actually happened. Researchers have found hundreds of graves where bodies were clearly tampered with after burial. These weren't isolated incidents. This was standard practice in many communities. The fear of ghosts was so intense that it created an entire industry around death. Professional grave watchers would be hired to monitor fresh graves for signs of supernatural activity. Priests would perform special rituals to keep spirits at bay. Families would pay enormous amounts of money for proper burials to prevent their loved ones from returning as angry ghosts. But the really terrifying part? Medieval ghosts weren't just spooky apparitions that rattled chains and said boo. According to medieval beliefs, ghosts could physically harm you. They could spread disease, cause crops to fail, kill livestock, and even murder living people. There are countless medieval chronicles that describe ghost attacks in vivid detail. In one famous case from 12th century England, a ghost was said to have terrorized an entire village for months. The spirit would appear at night, breaking into houses, attacking people in their beds, and spreading a mysterious illness that killed dozens of villagers. The villagers tried everything. They hired priests to perform exorcisms. They blessed their houses with holy water. They carried protective amulets and crosses. Nothing worked. The ghost kept coming back night after night, growing more violent each time. Finally, in desperation, the villagers dug up the suspected corpse. According to the chronicle, when they opened the grave, they found the body was completely unchanged, as if the person had just died. This was taken as proof that the spirit was indeed haunting them. So they cut up the body, burned it to ash, and scattered the ashes in a river. Only then did the hauntings stop. Stories like this weren't considered folklore or superstition. They were treated as historical fact. Monks wrote them down in official chronicles. Church authorities investigated ghost sightings like modern police investigate crimes. The fear of the restless dead was woven into the very fabric of medieval society. And this fear affected everything. The way people built their houses, with specific protections against spirits. The way they conducted funerals, with elaborate rituals to ensure the dead stayed dead. The way they treated their neighbors, because you never knew who might come back to haunt you after death. Medieval people lived every day knowing that death wasn't an ending. It was just another beginning. And sometimes, that beginning involved a very angry ghost who had a score to settle with the living.
Number 8. Demons entering while you sleep. If you think modern people have trouble sleeping, you haven't heard about medieval sleep anxiety. Medieval people were terrified of going to sleep, and it had nothing to do with work stress or social media. They believed that sleep was when you were most vulnerable to demonic possession. Picture this scenario that kept medieval people awake at night. You're lying in bed, finally drifting off to sleep after a long day of medieval survival. But the moment you start to relax, demons are preparing to attack. They're waiting in the shadows, ready to slip into your body through any opening they can find. Medieval medical and religious texts are filled with warnings about sleep demons. These weren't metaphorical demons representing bad dreams. These were literal evil spirits that could physically enter your body while you slept and take control of your soul. The fear was based on a combination of religious doctrine and medical theory that made perfect sense to medieval minds. During sleep, they believed your soul became partially separated from your body. This created a window of opportunity for evil spirits to slip in and take up residence. But demons were sneaky. They wouldn't just force their way in. They had specific methods that medieval people documented in terrifying detail. Demons could enter through your mouth if you slept with it open. They could slip in through your nose during deep breathing. They could even enter through your ears if you weren't careful. The most feared method was mouth possession. Medieval people believed that if you slept on your back with your mouth open, you were basically sending an invitation to every demon in the area. The mouth was seen as the gateway to the soul, and sleeping with it open was like leaving your front door unlocked in a bad neighborhood. This fear led to some pretty extreme sleep practices. Medieval people would tie cloth around their mouths before going to sleep. They would sleep in specific positions designed to keep all body openings closed. Some would even sleep sitting up to prevent their mouths from falling open. But the precautions didn't stop there. Medieval bedrooms were like fortress bunkers designed to keep demons out. People would sprinkle holy water around their beds, place crosses on every wall, keep blessed candles burning all night, recite specific prayers before sleeping, and wear protective amulets even while asleep. Rich people could afford elaborate demon-proofing for their bedrooms. Poor people had to make do with whatever protection they could find. But rich or poor, everyone took sleep demons seriously. The symptoms of demonic possession were well documented in medieval texts. If you woke up feeling unusually tired, that could be a sign that demons had been feeding on your energy during the night. Strange dreams were obvious evidence of demonic influence. Waking up with unexplained injuries meant demons had been fighting with your soul while you slept. Sleep talking was considered extremely dangerous because it meant demons were using your voice to communicate with other evil spirits. People who walked in their sleep were obviously under demonic control. Even simple things like grinding your teeth or snoring could be interpreted as signs of supernatural interference. Medieval medical texts describe cases of people who went to sleep as normal humans and woke up as completely different individuals. Their personalities changed overnight. They spoke in voices that weren't their own. They knew things they couldn't possibly know. They had memories of places they'd never been. According to medieval understanding, these people had been possessed while they slept. The demon had pushed their original soul aside and taken control of their body. Sometimes the original soul could be restored through exorcism, but sometimes the possession was permanent and the person was lost forever. The fear was so intense that some people developed severe insomnia, afraid to fall asleep at all. Medieval medical texts describe treatments for people who were literally afraid to close their eyes. Monks and priests would sometimes sit with terrified individuals all night, praying continuously to keep demons away. But here's what made this fear especially terrifying. There was no way to be completely safe. Even the most elaborate precautions might not work. Demons were cunning and persistent. They could wait weeks or months for the perfect opportunity to strike. Medieval people believed that demons specifically targeted individuals who were spiritually weak or who had committed sins. If you had impure thoughts, if you had missed church services, if you had been unkind to your neighbors, you were basically painting a target on your soul for demon possession. This created a constant state of anxiety about spiritual purity. People would confess their sins obsessively, not just because they feared hell, but because they feared becoming demon bait while they slept. The practical impact of this fear was enormous. Medieval people structured their entire evening routines around demon prevention. They would spend hours in prayer before bed. They would carefully arrange protective objects around their sleeping areas. They would mentally review every sin they might have committed that day and beg forgiveness before closing their eyes. And even then, they never felt completely safe. Because in the medieval mind, sleep wasn't rest. It was a nightly battle between good and evil, fought on the battlefield of your own body. And you never knew if you would wake up as yourself or as something else entirely. Number 9. Trial by fire and water. Imagine being accused of a crime in medieval times. Today, you'd get a lawyer, evidence would be presented, witnesses would testify, and a jury would decide your fate based on facts. In medieval times, you got thrown in a river or set on fire. Literally. This is the terrifying world of trial by ordeal, and it was one of the most feared aspects of medieval justice. The basic idea was simple. If you were innocent, God would miraculously save you. If you were guilty, God would let you die horribly. It was considered the perfect justice system because it took human judgment out of the equation entirely. But for medieval people living under this system, the fear of being subjected to trial by ordeal was constant and overwhelming. Because here's the thing, you didn't need solid evidence to accuse someone of a crime. Suspicion was often enough. And once you were accused, you might find yourself facing a test that would literally kill you if God decided you were guilty. Let's talk about trial by fire first, because it was exactly as horrible as it sounds. The accused person would be forced to carry a red-hot piece of iron in their bare hands for a specific distance, usually 9 steps. The iron was heated until it was literally glowing. They would pick it up with their bare hands, walk 9 steps while carrying it, then drop it. Their hands would be immediately bandaged and sealed by church officials. After 3 days, the bandages would be removed. If their hands were healing cleanly, they were declared innocent. If the burns were infected or festering, they were guilty. And the punishment for guilt was usually death. But here's what made this absolutely terrifying. The outcome was basically random. Some people have naturally better healing ability than others. Some people might get infections just from bad luck. The cleanliness of the bandages, the skill of whoever applied them, even the weather conditions could affect healing. Medieval people knew this, even if they couldn't articulate it scientifically. They knew that trial by fire was essentially a death sentence with a tiny chance of survival. And they knew the chance had nothing to do with actual guilt or innocence. Trial by water was equally horrifying, but in a different way. The accused would be tied up and thrown into a river or pond. If they floated, they were guilty because pure water was rejecting their sinful body. If they sang, they were innocent. Of course, if you sang, you would also drown unless someone pulled you out quickly. So your choice was float and be executed for being guilty, or sink and possibly drown while being declared innocent. Either way, your survival was basically up to chance and the reflexes of whoever was supposed to fish you out of the water. There was also trial by combat, where you would fight your accuser or their champion. The winner was declared innocent, the loser was guilty. If you were a small person accused by a large, trained warrior, your chances of survival were essentially zero, regardless of your actual guilt or innocence. The psychological terror of living under this system is hard to imagine. Every argument with a neighbor, every business dispute, every personal conflict carried the potential of a death sentence. If someone didn't like you, they could accuse you of theft, adultery, witchcraft, or any number of crimes. And you might find yourself facing trial by ordeal. Medieval records show that people would spend enormous amounts of money trying to avoid trial by ordeal. They would pay bribes to accusers to drop charges. They would hire the best priest to pray for them. They would make pilgrimages and donations to churches, hoping to build up enough spiritual credit to survive the ordeal. But the scariest part was that the system was considered foolproof. If you died during trial by ordeal, everyone knew you were guilty. Your death was proof of your sin. Your family would be shamed. Your property might be confiscated. Your soul was considered damned. If you survived, you were declared innocent, but you might be permanently disabled from the ordeal. People who survived trial by fire often lost the use of their hands. People who survived trial by water sometimes suffered permanent lung damage. Even innocence came with a terrible price. The fear was so intense that many people confessed to crimes they didn't commit rather than face trial by ordeal. At least with a confession, you might get a quicker death or the possibility of religious forgiveness. Trial by ordeal offered only a tiny chance of survival and a large chance of dying in agony. Medieval chronicles describe people becoming physically ill from fear when they learned they would face trial by ordeal. Some people died from terror before the actual trial took place. Others went insane from the stress of waiting for their ordeal. And here's what makes this even more terrifying. Trial by ordeal wasn't reserved for major crimes. You could face burning or drowning for relatively minor offenses. Stealing food, adultery, lying under oath, practicing folk medicine, or even just being unpopular in your community could land you in front of a glowing piece of iron. The system created a climate of constant fear and paranoia. People were afraid to make enemies. They were afraid to stand out in any way. They were afraid to be different because difference could be interpreted as guilt, and guilt meant facing an ordeal that would probably kill you. Medieval people lived knowing that their justice system was basically a lottery with their lives as the stakes. And the house always had better odds than the players. Number 10. Eternal damnation. We've talked about fears of death, disease, demons, and painful ordeals. But now we need to discuss the fear that dominated every aspect of medieval life, the fear that made all other fears seem small by comparison, the absolute terror of spending eternity in hell. This wasn't just a background worry for medieval people. It was an obsessive, consuming fear that influenced every decision they made, every word they spoke, every thought they allowed themselves to think. Because in the medieval worldview, this life was just a brief test, and failing the test meant infinite suffering forever. Let me put this in perspective. Every other fear we've discussed was about temporary suffering. The plague might kill you, but death would end your pain. Demons might possess you, but exorcism might free you. Famine might starve you, but at least starvation would eventually end one way or another. Hell was different. Hell was forever. Not for a long time. Not until you learned your lesson. Forever. Infinite suffering with no possibility of escape, no hope of redemption, no chance that it would ever end. Medieval descriptions of hell were incredibly detailed and absolutely horrifying. This wasn't the cartoony hell with little red devils and pitchforks that we see in modern media. Medieval hell was a carefully constructed torture chamber designed by infinite intelligence to cause maximum suffering for eternity. The torments were both physical and psychological. Burning fire that never consumed your body, so you could feel yourself burning forever. Ice so cold it caused agony, but never froze you solid enough to stop the pain. Demons with infinite creativity for torture, constantly inventing new ways to cause suffering. But the physical torments were just the beginning. Medieval theology taught that the worst part of hell was the spiritual suffering. The complete separation from God meant absolute despair. You would know with perfect certainty that your suffering would never end. You would remember every moment of happiness you had ever experienced in life, knowing you would never feel happiness again. You would see the souls of the saved in heaven, enjoying eternal bliss, while you suffered eternal torment. You would know that your suffering was entirely your own fault, that you had chosen hell through your actions on earth. The guilt and regret would be as painful as any physical torture. And here's what made this fear so overwhelming. The standards for avoiding hell were incredibly strict. It wasn't enough to be generally good. You had to be perfect. Every sin, no matter how small, made you deserving of eternal damnation unless you properly repented. But proper repentance was complicated. You had to feel genuine sorrow for your sin, not just fear of punishment. You had to confess to a priest. You had to perform whatever penance the priest assigned. You had to make amends for any harm you had caused. And you had to truly resolve never to commit that sin again. Miss any part of this process, and you were still going to hell. Die before you could complete your penance, and you were going to hell. Commit a sin after confessing previous sins, and you were back on the path to hell. The list of sins that could damn you was enormous. Murder, theft, and adultery were obvious. But you could also go to hell for lying, gossiping, being lazy, eating too much, drinking too much, having impure thoughts, missing church, disrespecting your parents, being proud, being greedy, being envious, being angry, or being sad in the wrong way. Even trying to avoid sin could become sinful. Being too proud of your virtue was the sin of pride. Being too worried about your salvation showed lack of faith in God's mercy. Being too confident about your salvation showed the sin of presumption. Medieval people lived in constant fear that they were accidentally committing sins without realizing it. They worried that their confessions weren't sincere enough. They feared that their penances weren't sufficient. They were terrified that they might die suddenly without a chance for last rites. This fear created an entire economy around salvation. People would pay enormous sums to have masses said for their souls. They would go on expensive pilgrimages to holy sites. They would buy indulgences from the church, which were supposed to reduce their time in purgatory. Rich people would build entire chapels and hire priests to pray for their souls in perpetuity. Poor people would spend their last coins on candles to burn in front of holy statues. Everyone, regardless of social class, lived in terror of eternal damnation. The fear was so intense that it caused actual mental illness. Medieval medical texts describe people who became obsessed with their sinfulness, confessing the same sins over and over, convinced that they hadn't been properly forgiven. Some people developed such intense scrupulosity that they were afraid to do anything at all, because any action might accidentally be sinful. Others went in the opposite direction, becoming so convinced of their damnation that they gave up trying to be good altogether. If you're going to hell anyway, why not enjoy the sins that were sending you there? Medieval artwork depicting hell was deliberately designed to increase this fear. Church walls were covered with paintings showing the torments of the damned in graphic detail. These weren't just religious instruction. They were psychological warfare designed to terrify people into obedience. But here's what made the fear of hell especially crushing. It made every moment of happiness feel dangerous. If you enjoyed food too much, that was gluttony. If you took pleasure in beautiful things, that was vanity. If you felt proud of your accomplishments, that was the deadliest sin of all. Medieval people couldn't even enjoy the good things in life without worrying that their enjoyment was sinful. They lived in a world where pleasure was suspicious, happiness was dangerous, and the safest emotional state was constant fear of divine judgment. And this fear never ended. Even the most religious people, even saints and monks, lived in terror of hell. Because no matter how good you tried to be, you could always be better. No matter how much you repented, you might not have repented enough. No matter how many good works you performed, you might still be secretly prideful about performing them. Medieval people went to sleep every night knowing they might die before morning and face eternal judgment. They woke up every morning knowing that any sin they committed that day might be their last act before death and damnation. This wasn't just a personal fear. It was a social fear that shaped entire communities. People policed each other's behavior, not just out of moral concern, but out of terror that God might punish the entire community for tolerating sin. The fear of hell created a society where everyone was constantly watching everyone else, looking for signs of sin, ready to report transgressions to religious authorities. It was a world where your neighbors might condemn you to save their own souls. Medieval people lived every day in the shadow of eternity, knowing that their brief time on earth was just the prologue to an endless story. And they were absolutely terrified that their story might have a very bad ending. The reality of medieval fear. So there you have it. The 10 things that medieval people feared most. And as you can see, it wasn't what most people think. It wasn't just war and plague and obvious dangers. Medieval people lived in a world where invisible threats surrounded them constantly. They were afraid of demons that could possess them while they slept. They feared that their neighbors might be Satan in disguise. They lived in terror of sudden death without proper religious preparation. They worried that eating the wrong foods might damn their souls. They feared that their own bodies might betray them through possession or illness. But what's most striking about these fears is how they shaped every aspect of medieval life. These weren't just abstract worries. They were practical concerns that determined how people built their houses, what they ate, how they slept, who they trusted, and how they spent their time. Medieval people created elaborate systems of protection against invisible threats. They developed complex religious rituals to ward off spiritual dangers. They built their entire social structure around the need for spiritual security in an uncertain world. And in many ways, their fears made sense given what they knew about the world. Without modern science to explain natural phenomena, supernatural explanations seemed perfectly reasonable. Without modern medicine to treat diseases, spiritual causes seemed as likely as physical ones. The medieval worldview was internally consistent. If you believe that spiritual forces control the physical world, then spiritual protection became a matter of life and death. If you believe that your eternal fate depended on your earthly behavior, then every action became incredibly important. Understanding these fears helps us understand medieval people not as superstitious primitives, but as rational people trying to navigate a world that seemed filled with invisible dangers. Their solutions might seem strange to us, but they were logical responses to the threats they perceive around them. Medieval people weren't more fearful than we are. They were just afraid of different things. And in their world, surrounded by mysteries they couldn't explain and threats they couldn't control, their fears made perfect sense. The next time you read about medieval history, Remember that these people weren't just dealing with visible challenges like war and famine. They were living in a world where evil could be hiding anywhere, where salvation required constant vigilance, and where the smallest mistake might have eternal consequences. It was a world where fear was a survival strategy, and paranoia was just good sense. Understanding these fears is the key to understanding medieval life itself. Subscribe for more deep dives into history's most surprising truths.